Robert Hutch Hutchinson was educated in the public schools and in the woods of northern Florida. He received a degree in psychology from Emory University and attended graduate school at the University of Florida in architecture and planning. He was the first executive director of the Alachua Conservation Trust in the late 1980s, a job he returned to in 2008. He has served as the executive director of the Gainesville Downtown Redevelopment Agency and the Southeastern Forest Trust, a forest certification organization associated with the Rainforest Alliance. He has also worked for the Nature Conservancy and as development director for the Florida Museum of Natural History. He has produced a dozen documentaries on a wide range of topics and taught video production at Santa Fe College. Hutch served as county commissioner, where he was instrumental in the passage of the Alachua County Forever program, a $29 million land conservation bond referendum, and more recently he spearheaded the successful $30 million Wild Spaces Public Places referendum. He serves on many boards, including the Gainesville Chamber of Commerce, the Conservation Burial Board, Friends of Paynes Prairie, and the No More Homeless Pets Coalition Board. He's an avid hiker and sailor with his wife, who recently retired as Gainesville's city arborist, and he has played keyboards for 3 decades with his band, the Weeds of Eden. Welcome, Hutch.
Glad to be back.
You know, that's right. I want to do a separate show just on how a rock and roll band stays together for 30 years, but
yeah, that is a challenge, I assure you.
But today we're gonna concentrate on Alachua Conservation Trust. And before we kind of dig into ACT, can you kind of talk to us about the lay of the land prior to the formation of Alachua Conservation Trust in Alachua County?
Well, if you go back to 1970, there was no land in Alachua County that had been purposefully conserved other than Austin Cary Forest and a few city parks. And so we often think that these places like Paynes Prairie and so forth have always been there or that they were always conserved. But actually in the 1970s, Paynes Prairie was a working cattle ranch and San Falasco Hammock was partially in forestry. And in the early 70s, a lot of things changed. The environmental movement came along and there was a definite push by a lot of people to start thinking about saving these places. And interestingly enough, the impetus behind the saving of Paynes Prairie was the Gainesville Garden Club. That was the predecessor to some of today's more traditional environmental organizations. Right. So the early 70s was a time when the state generated some money and Alachua County's activists, who as always are sort of the forefront of the state, created the first and the second state preserves, San Falasco Hammock and Paynes Prairie. And
was this a dedicated state program that had funding for these things?
Exactly. Or? They created by today's standards, seemingly a very small pot of money, a few $1 million, and it actually took a couple of years of that money to buy these 2 state preserves, even though the transactions were a good deal, and certainly by today's standards, a wonderful investment.
And then you flash forward to 1988.
Well, then there were other activities around the state to start conserving lands. The impetus locally was kind of interesting because what happened was President Ronald Reagan, with great fanfare, convened a President's Commission on the Great American Outdoors, I think was the title of it. And they spent a lot of time looking at what was happening, how people were interacting with nature and how good we were doing in protecting our resources and so forth. Really the first time in a couple of decades that anybody had really comprehensively looked at what was going on. And they made some recommendations, one of which was greenways are important, linear corridors to connect people with the environment. But at the same time that the president was doing it, a group got together in Alachua County, appointed by the Alachua County Commission, and it was a number of leading citizens in the community, and they came up with a fairly similar set of recommendations, one of which was to create an urban defining green belt around Gainesville to start protecting some of these lands that had already begun but hadn't really been connected up.
And what year are we talking
This would
about?
have been in the mid-'80s.
Mid-'80s.
And the second recommendation they made was to form a local land trust. Land trusts were, the oldest ones are about 100 years old, but really they started taking off in the 70s or 80s. I think when Alachua Conservation Trust was formed, we may have been about the 300th in the country, and today there's 1,700.
Wow.
So anyway, this, this local group formed a land trust and started a concerted effort to save lands.
And this was the Alachua Conservation Trust?
And this was Alachua Conservation Trust, a private nonprofit charitable organization. And some of our early board members were people like John Mahan and Al Ring, who is a professor of real estate at the University of Florida. Court Collier, Gainesville City Commissioner, was very instrumental. And that group got going. They hired me to be their first executive director, and the rest is history that we'll talk more about.
That's right. And can you talk about maybe some of the early acquisitions or early projects that you were involved in?
One of my favorite stories is that the state of Florida had geared up to buy land to add on to existing parks, and they called it their In-Holdings and Additions program. And they identified a lot of land around Paynes Prairie State Preserve. The most important was Hickory Ranch, which is almost 1,000 acres on the east side of the preserve. And so ACT agreed that we would go out and buy this land for the state. And so I went in and started negotiating with the family, which was the Cohn family, and had a few preliminary conversations, and finally I had my appraisals, my secret appraisals in hand, and my contract. Went in, had a nice chat with them for 15 minutes and walked out with a signed contract for $1 million. And I said, I can do this. And that was the easiest, most wonderful transaction I've ever done, and everyone since then has been a total pain, and dealing with all kinds of interesting characters and difficult funding problems and so forth, but I was hooked. And so we did another transaction to add on to San Francisco Hammock, which is where the nice bike trails are now. That was an ACT acquisition.
Was that right?
We then worked on purchasing land up and down the Swanee River for that water management district, and worked with a number of public agencies, but in no case were we buying land for ourselves. That came much later. We were pretty much a transactional agent. As a matter of fact, we didn't have any donors. We just worked, transactions and took a little bit from each transaction. So.
And
really,
the funding was primarily
from the state, sometimes from a water management district.
One of the things I remember is there was that referendum to create a greenway, and I know that that greenway has progressed, maybe not exactly in the way that that referendum had envisioned, but tell me about that.
Yeah, the Hogtown Creek Greenway was a project that had originally been conceived back in the Nixon era, but he vetoed some funding for it, and we revived the idea, got some money from the state's Florida Communities Trust during their first year, and attempted to acquire a linear corridor from the north to the south part of Gainesville along that creek. Right. Ultimately, we didn't get it all. We got key parts of it. There was some controversy about it based on whether you lived right on it or a little farther away from it, but it's just one of those great projects. The vision that we've been sort of working on, that I've been working on for the Gainesville green space, is to have a ring of green space around Gainesville, similar to the one they have in Vienna, Austria, in Boulder, Colorado, and other places. And then to have spokes that radiate out to it, so that wherever you are in Gainesville, it's a short hike or bike ride to get on one of these greenway spokes, like the Gainesville-Hawthorne Trail, or the Waldo Trail, or the Hogtown Creek Greenway, and get out to this urban defining green belt, which is like Paynes Prairie or San Francisco Hammock. Or,
right.
And so that, I think, creates the most opportunities for a livable city and wonderful recreation.
Then a few years later, what was an amazing effort by you and others created the Alachua County Forever program. One of a couple of times that our voters have chosen to tax themselves for an issue that's very important to them. Can you kind of tell us what led up to Alachua County Forever and about your involvement?
Yeah, the interesting part of that is I got elected to the County Commission in '98, and you know, I got elected on a smart growth and sustainable transportation and land conservation campaign. And so I woke up on the morning of Y2K and kind of with a hangover and realized that here I was well into my term and the land conservation part hadn't been done. We'd started the other parts. And so I was having some, shall we say, parliamentary difficulties on the commission getting some budget amendments through. So I decided that we were just going to have to do this thing as a citizens initiative. And so with Pam Zaber and Doug Hornbeck and a few other volunteers, we started what can only be described as a fake grassroots effort to get this thing going. We started collecting signatures and so forth, and darned if it didn't turn into a grassroots movement. Next thing we knew, people that we had no idea who they were stepping forward and doing things, and I've never kind of seen the organic evolution of a true grassroots movement like that. And ultimately we passed it was a $250,000 property tax increase for 20 years that was bonded to the present time, generated a pot of money. And what was really nice about it, really much of this happened after I left the commission, is the county staff was formed, Ramesh Butch and other professionals were hired, and they have run an absolutely sterling program. Keep in mind that the history of public land acquisition programs in Florida has not been always that wonderful. There have been people who've gone to jail, there have been cronyism, picking wrong properties to purchase. A lot of bad things have happened in the public land acquisition sphere. And Alachua County has run an absolutely flawless program, picked great properties. I don't know the exact numbers, but I think Ramesh has purchased something like $79 million worth of land using less than $29 million of our own money.
Right.
So for every dollar that he's spent, he's managed to find $2 somewhere else. And absolutely picked up beautiful properties. Bar Hammock and Pfeiffer Flatwoods and Mill Creek and so forth are some of the best properties you can imagine.
I've also watched in wonder at the way ACT and Alachua County Forever have worked together.
Well, it's an interesting dance because we actually try to stay out of each other's way most of the time, but when there's something that needs to happen that we can jump in and purchase a property. Probably the best example is Pfeiffer Flatwoods. That property was going to an auction block in less than 90 days. Somebody had to show up. We got a bunch of donors and lenders and so forth together, managed to get the property, and then the county has a process, which we're thankful they do. Took them longer, and eventually they purchased the property from us. And we've done that maybe on one other occasion in a similar manner, but generally speaking, the county does their thing, we do ours, we know what they're doing, they know what we're doing, we stay out of each other's way, and it uses the best aspects of a nonprofit charity and the best aspects of a government agency to accomplish essentially the same mission.
So basically a bunch of folks gave you a short-term loan to get Pfeiffer Flatwoods.
In the case of Pfeiffer Flatwoods, we borrowed over $3 million in 90 days. At one point, I claimed I was closing more loans than any banker in Gainesville because,
That's right.
But people were very generous. They stepped forward, and we were able to go save this property. It's 3 miles along the Gainesville-Hawthorne Rail Trail. Yeah. Very important property, and we had a Louisiana developer who was the other bidder on the project, so it could have gone very badly.
You know, you're so intertwined in so many different aspects of conservation. In some ways, even more amazing to me was the work that was done on the Wild Spaces Public Places referendum, because that was at a time when the economy had already started going south, I think, and for voters in that atmosphere to once again vote to tax themselves for not just land conservation, but also the other projects that were involved. What was your involvement in that?
Well, again, we knew that Alachua County Forever was running out of money. We knew there were still good properties on the list. We also knew that we'd had one good bite at the apple and that there were other interests, there were active recreation interests, the senior center and so forth. We put together a coalition that was willing to work together, figure out how to divvy up the money. It was actually a pretty difficult project because cities get a portion of the sales tax, as does the county, and then you have to divvy it up between recreation and wild spaces. And we managed to put it all together, cobbled together this coalition, took it to the voters, and they decided again that this was something they were worth spending money on. One of the truly great things about Alachua County is they care about protecting the environment.
What were the percentages on those two referendums? Do you recall?
I'm going to say that 62% in the Alachua County Forever referendum, and I know that we won convincingly in wild spaces, but it was much closer, and had it not been for strong support among the college students and the African American community, I'm pretty sure that wild spaces would have gone down. But that was one where we'd sort of built in something for everything, and it was a good example of true coalition building.
And then I know another very important local effort that you've been involved in is the creation of the registry, so that these lands that are being purchased and gathered are protected forever. Can you tell me about that?
Well, one of the things we heard during the Wild Spaces campaign is, well, I'm not so sure we'll support that, because we heard that Alachua County Forever really doesn't mean forever. And there'd been a few scares with, in the city of Gainesville, there was some talk of swapping property with Walmart and some other issues like that. So we started looking, with the help of the University of Florida's Conservation Clinic at the law school, we started looking at how would a local government truly protect land long term. It's one thing to own it, but on any given Tuesday evening, a county commission on a simple majority could sell off a piece of land or swap it or change the use. So we thought, what can we do to add to the difficulty of doing that? We can't take that option away. And we looked at a number of options, the best one being the Registry of Protected Public Places. And we're the first local government in the nation to do it. Both the city and the county have created this program through charter amendments. And basically it just says if a local government decides they want to swap, sell, or change the use of a property, they have to get the voters to agree to it. Right. And we think that's fair because the voters agreed to put the money on the table to purchase these properties. And so it doesn't mean that something can't be sold or swapped or changed, but it does mean that the voters have to agree. And so we think a future county commission who decides their corner of a park needs to be a fire station or something like that will have to make a convincing enough argument and take it to the voters.
And currently the county commission is in a process that citizens have been very involved in to, decide what properties go on. And
yeah, the county commission has put some properties on the list, and they're holding some back pending further information. And actually, I'm supportive of them being very deliberative about this, because the whole point is to permanently protect these properties.
Right, right. So many interesting projects that ACT is involved in. Are there highlights? Can you give me kind of a maybe a greatest hits of your projects?
One of the things that we do that is outside of pure acquisition is we do conservation easements. And we have about a dozen private landowners who have donated the development rights of their property to us. They retain the ownership. They can still use the property for recreation or farming. In some cases, they live on it. But the rights to subdivide it or to do clear cutting or other things that might not be good for the conservation values of the property, they've given to us, and we just extinguish those rights. There are tremendous tax benefits for doing so. But there's, more importantly, the feeling that you're protecting your land forever while not having to give it away.
Right.
And we've got several in negotiation now, and it's really a tool that I think is going to be increasingly used in the future, in part because there'll be fewer public acquisition dollars, so we can actually focus on it. It's never been a strong focus of ours, but some of those negotiations of people who own their family land and really want it to be that way forever can be very moving.
I was reading through your information, and I was pretty impressed and amazed by the variety of ways that you can help people with that kind of thing. And you're a 501c3, correct? Sure. So many, many tax advantages that are possible with these things. Another thing that's just fascinating to me is we now have a green cemetery in Alachua County. Can you tell us about the Prairie Creek Conservation Cemetery?
Well, since July of 2010, people have an alternative in Alachua County to a traditional cemetery. And what we do at Prairie Creek is we allow people to be buried in a biodegradable container, usually just a shroud, sometimes a plain pine box or cardboard box. And they aren't inside a concrete vault, and there's no marble tombstone. The site is marked with a tree and a very small marker flush with the ground. And the proceeds from the burials, people pay $2,000 for the privilege, go towards further land conservation. So we intend to protect this land by creating sacred burial grounds, one burial at a time, to pay for this land and other lands with the proceeds. And it's a spreading movement. We're the 4th conservation burial ground in the nation, meaning that we meet the highest standards of doing what we do. But we're already thinking of opening up similar cemeteries in surrounding counties, and there's a lot of interest in this. So what surprised me about it is I went into the notion of green burial as a committed environmentalist thinking of another way to fund land conservation. But what has surprised me in dealing with the families and the friends is how much people are approaching this as a way where they can have more control over the burial process. In the old days, when a loved one died, the women sort of got the body ready and the guys went out and built a coffin or dug the grave, and everybody came together, and that's very much the feeling of what we do. Sometimes the bodies are carried out to the cemetery in a horse-drawn cart, and people walk together out to the cemetery. We have the cooperation of funeral homes in Alachua County, so this isn't about us not appreciating what funeral homes do, but it's about giving people an alternative to cremation or to burial with all the concrete and brass and steel and all that other stuff. So it's definitely a movement that's growing, and it's sort of the last place. You know, we have home burials and home schools, and home births and home schools and so forth. Now we essentially have home funerals, and we're the leader in that area.
We've talked a lot about your involvement and partnership with Alachua County, but you've also got some really fascinating partnerships with local arts organizations, which doesn't seem to be a kind of a obvious kind of thing to tie in together. Tell me about some of the partnerships you've had. I know you've been involved with Annie Pace.
Well, the Artists Alliance of North Florida and Florida's Eden, all those organizations have clearly shown how much they appreciate the environment. They do paint outs, and they are always donating to benefits. So we are thinking of ways to strengthen that, and one of the ways we'll probably do that is to turn our Prairie Creek Lodge into basically a campus for teaching art. We know there's a lot of baby boomers who are about to retire. They live up north. They'd like to come down here, spend a week in Florida learning how to paint watercolors. And so we recently were rezoned by Alachua County to create, we don't exactly have a working name, but we're calling it the Prairie Creek Institute, but it'll be a place where people can come and learn those hobby skills or spiritual growth skills or whatever that they have been yearning to do. We think we'll be targeting people in their later years, 40 or 50 on, and we think it's a way to create jobs in Alachua County for our struggling artists while creating a way for people to appreciate the environment and all that we have. So it's sort of the next step of linking environmental groups and arts organizations. I can say that we enjoy, a couple years ago we wrote a play for the historic Hale Homestead, one of our properties, that sort of featured the history of the place, and we're doing the same thing for Prairie Creek. We know that there is a famous battle out there that will have its 200th anniversary next year, the battle between King Payne of the local Seminole tribes and Colonel Daniel Noonan, and their 200th anniversary of that battle is next year. So this year we're going to be planning on how to celebrate that through the arts and historical information and so forth.
Well, let me know when the casting call for the recreation is.
All right, good. Yeah, you can. You want to be an Indian or you want to be a Georgian?
I'm not going to make up my mind just yet, but Prairie Creek Lodge is an amazing property. You mentioned the Hale Homestead that you've been involved in. I've been to a couple of events out there, and it's just remarkable. And I think you're using that as a really interesting way to support the Conservation Trust too, for folks who haven't been there yet. Tell me, how did you get Prairie Creek Lodge, and what are some of the things you're doing there?
Yeah, Prairie Creek Lodge is a 6,200-foot former hunting lodge. Elmer Hubick bought it and developed it. He was a big Marion County thoroughbred racer, and then he sold it to the Crevasse family, who operated it as an exotic game breeding facility, and then they sold it to us. And we're using it as a community space for all kinds of events. We're having a didgeridoo concert coming up. We have a number of different folk musicians out there as part of our Sandhill Stage concert series. We have square dances, and we have all kinds of art classes and so forth, but it is what we hope to become the centerpiece for this Prairie Creek Institute. Very unique space, a lot of weddings, funerals, all kinds of things out there.
I've got a bunch of stuff that I want to talk to you about, but amazingly we're out of time, so we're going to ask you to come back because I want to go into some more detail. But thank you so much for coming. Yeah.
Thanks a lot, Mark.
Yeah.
And the rush of you will last as long as we now a song can go on and on and on and on. This verse is hummed to me from your surely voice still. Some ancient truth revealed.
To help explain home watering restrictions, we brought together these highly trained sprinklers. Say hello, guys. Now, homes with odd-numbered addresses may water only on Wednesday and Saturday. Those with even-numbered home addresses may water only on Thursday and Sunday. Watering restrictions are mandatory, so unless your day and number are up, make sure those sprinklers stay down. Water only when needed and not between 10 a.m. and 4 p.m. Learn about these and other restrictions at floridaswater.com.
We used to write letters to each other a lot, and it was intimidating to talk to him sometimes because he just seemed so isolated by himself.
She started talking about how she wishes that her life was over and she wishes that she was never born.
So I knew he had depression, but I didn't know it was that far.
Said something to me about killing himself.
Tell somebody, tell an adult, a counselor, parent, whatever.
You have to try and help them get help.
You have to take it seriously. You can't assume that they're just saying it because the risk is too great.
It's a hard situation because you do risk making that person very angry and losing their friendship.
It would have been horrible for me if she never talked to me again, but I'd live with it because I know she'd be alive.
Definitely worth getting help, even if you think you're going to lose a friendship, because it's better to lose the friendship than the actual friend.
Welcome to your Alachua County Library District, where we're thinking outside the book. What does the library have for you? DVDs, video software, music CDs, and it's free. Wireless hotspots at every branch, all for free. Friendly assistants, online databases, it's also free. And of course, books on every subject, large print and more, all at the best price, free. The library has free research databases with access from home or the library. The Alachua County Library District, thinking outside the book.